It was a quiet summer evening when Linda and her husband, Richard, rented the legendary Twin Palms estate in Palm Springs, once the home of Frank Sinatra. Nestled in the desert, the iconic mid-century modern house was steeped in history, from its distinctive piano-shaped swimming pool to its reputation as a party hub for the Rat Pack. The couple, both fans of classic Hollywood, were thrilled to spend a few nights in the home of O.L. Blue Eyes. Their first evening was magical. They sipped martinis by the pool as the sun dipped below the San Jacinto Mountains, painting the sky with vibrant streaks of orange and purple. Richard hummed "Fly Me to the Moon," his favorite Sinatra tune, as the couple toasted to their stay. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The stillness of the desert air seemed to carry a faint melody, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably a piano. Linda paused mid-sip, tilting her head toward the sound. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Richard nodded, setting down his glass. The melody grew clearer, weaving through the walls of the house like a ghostly whisper. It wasn't from the stereo, they'd turned it off hours ago. The song was "One for My Baby," played with the intimacy of a live performance, as if someone were seated at the piano in the living room. Cautiously, they stepped inside. The grand piano, a centerpiece of the home, stood gleaming under dim lights. The keys were still. The music continued, yet no source could be found. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. "It's probably a neighbor playing music," she said, though her voice trembled with doubt. Richard, normally skeptical of ghost stories, didn't respond. The melody faded as abruptly as it began. Shrugging off the odd experience, they tried to enjoy the rest of the evening. The next morning, Linda explored the backyard. The desert air was cool and inviting, and she found herself drawn to a corner of the garden where a small table and chair stood. She froze. A man sat at the table. His back was to her, but she could see the crisp lines of his suit and the way his hand cradled a glass of amber liquid. He seemed at ease, gazing out at the mountains. "Hello," she called hesitantly. The man turned slightly, enough for her to catch the silhouette of a sharp jawline and a fedora perched at an angle. Linda's breath caught in her throat. He was the spitting image of Sinatra. Before she could speak again, the figure faded like mist dissolving in the sunlight. The glass remained on the table, the faint scent of whiskey lingering in the air. That night, Linda and Richard sat together by the pool, the piano's ghostly melody returning as if bidding them good night. It wasn't frightening, they decided. In fact, it felt as though Sinatra himself was still there, enjoying the evening with a drink in hand and a tune in his heart, just as he had decades before. The couple left Twin Palms the next morning, leaving behind a note for the next visitors. "If you hear the piano, don't be afraid. It's just Frank reminding us that legends never truly leave." The couple planned to leave the next morning, but Linda found herself drawn to the house's history. She'd read that Sinatra threw infamous parties here, that the walls of this home had once echoed with laughter, clinking glasses, and live music. Now, the quiet felt almost too quiet, as if the house itself resented being left behind. As they packed their things, Linda paused at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys, tempted to play a few notes. She pressed one, a soft, resonant C, but before she could strike another, she heard a sharp knock on the sliding glass door behind her. "Richard," she called. No response. She turned toward the door, the desert sun casting long shadows across the living room. No one was there. The knock came again, louder this time. She stepped closer, heart pounding. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned in to look outside. That's when she saw it. A figure near the edge of the pool, standing motionless in the growing dusk. A man in a dark suit, a glass of something golden in his hand. "Richard," she shouted, her voice tinged with panic. Footsteps thundered down the hall as Richard appeared. What's wrong?" She pointed toward the pool. "Do you see him?" Richard squinted through the glass. The figure was gone. "See who?" Linda felt her knees weaken, but she steadied herself. I don't know. Forget it. Maybe I'm just tired." But Richard wasn't convinced. "You've been on edge since last night," he said. "Let's just head out early." Linda nodded, but deep down, She wasn't ready to leave. That night, despite their plans, the couple stayed. They sat on the couch in silence, too unnerved to sleep. Around midnight, Richard excused himself to the kitchen for a glass of water. Linda stayed put, her eyes darting to the piano. It stood like a sentinel in the dark, its polished surface reflecting faint moonlight. Without warning, the first notes of My Wave rang out, sharp and deliberate. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. The keys were moving, not pressed by invisible hands, but by a shadow, a figure sitting at the bench, its back to her. "Richard!" she screamed. He rushed in just in time to see the figure stand. They both froze as it turned to face them. The sharp blue eyes, the tilted fedora, the faint smirk, there was no mistaking him. The room seemed to hold its breath. The figure raised its glass, as if in a toast, then faded into the shadows. "Did you see that?" Linda whispered, clutching Richard's arm. He nodded, his face pale. "We're leaving. Now." As they drove away from Twin Palms, the car's radio crackled to life. Sinatra's voice filled the silence, clear and haunting. "And now, the end is near." Linda turned the dial, but the station wouldn't change. Richard swore under his breath, pressing every button, but the song played on. They didn't speak the rest of the drive, though the lyrics lingered in the air, as if Sinatra himself was following them into the night. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. By the time they reached the highway, Linda could no longer suppress the feeling gnawing at her. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity. Something about the way the figure had raised its glass, the way the piano had played on its own, felt purposeful. As though it wasn't trying to frighten them, but instead, invite them. "Richard," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Don't," he replied firmly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We're not talking about it. We're not going back." But Linda wasn't so sure. Sinatra was known for his love of theatrics, for always having the last word. What if this was his way of sharing something unfinished, hidden in the walls of the house? "Just hear me out," she started. Richard glared at her. "No. Whatever you're thinking, the answer is no." Linda hesitated, then nodded, but deep down, she wasn't ready to let it go. When they returned home the next day, Linda couldn't stop herself from researching the house. She combed through old photographs, interviews, and even obscure fan forums dedicated to Sinatra. Stories of strange happenings at Twin Palms were rare, but one post caught her eye. "Stayed at Twin Palms in the late 90s. Woke up to the sound of Sinatra singing in the middle of the night. Found a whiskey glass on the patio the next morning that wasn't ours. Locals say he left something behind in the house, something he wanted to protect. Never stayed there again." The post was signed with the initials RF. "Something he wanted to protect," she murmured, her mind racing. What could that mean? Over the next few days, Linda became consumed by the mystery. She replayed the events in her head, the piano, the man at the pool, the song on the radio. There had to be a reason it was all happening, a message she hadn't yet deciphered. Then came the envelope. It was slipped under their door one afternoon while Richard was out running errands. The paper was aged, the handwriting on the front bold and unmistakable, L. Foster. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words scrawled in Sinatra's signature style. "Come back." When Richard returned home, Linda was already packing. "Are you out of your mind?" he exclaimed, staring at the suitcase on the bed. "You're going back there?" "I have to," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I can't explain it, but it's like he's calling me. There's something he wants us to find." Richard groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Linda, this isn't a movie. It's not some treasure hunt. It's real," she interrupted. "You saw him too. You felt it. Don't pretend you didn't." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then he sighed. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we're doing it together." They arrived at Twin Palms just before sunset, the house eerily quiet under the fading light. Linda felt a strange mix of excitement and dread as they stepped inside. The piano was untouched, the pool still, but something was different. The air felt charged, as though the house was waiting for them. "Where do we start?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda didn't answer. She walked straight to the piano, drawn to it like a magnet. As she placed her hand on the polished surface, a chill ran through her body. That's when the music began. Soft at first, then louder. The opening bars of Strangers in the Night echoed through the room. Linda's heart raced as she looked around, searching for the source. Linda, Richard said, his voice shaking. She turned to see him standing by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on something in the mantelpiece. A single brick was slightly dislodged, as though it had been tampered with. Without a word, Linda rushed to his side. Together, they pulled the brick free, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, weathered leather box. Linda opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an old photograph of Sinatra surrounded by his closest friends, a handwritten note, and a gold pocket watch. The note read, "For those who understand, time is everything FS." Before Linda could make sense of it, the lights flickered, and the unmistakable sound of Sinatra's voice filled the room once more. Strangers in the night, exchanging glances. The air grew colder, the melody growing louder, as though the house itself was alive. Richard grabbed Linda's arm. "We need to go," he said urgently. But Linda didn't move. She stared at the watch, the photograph, and the note, feeling the weight of their discovery. "What if this is what he wanted us to find?" she whispered. Richard shook his head. "Then why does it feel like we're not alone?" From the corner of the room, a shadow shifted. Linda and Richard froze as the figure of a man stepped forward. His glass raised once more. This time he spoke. "You're not done yet." The man's voice was deep and smooth, carrying the weight of authority and charm. It was unmistakably Sinatra. Yet, as quickly as he appeared, the shadow dissolved, leaving only the echo of his words. "You're not done yet." Linda clutched the photograph and note, her pulse hammering in her ears. Richard's grip tightened on her arm as the room fell into an oppressive silence. "What does he mean?" Linda whispered. Richard scanned the room, his eyes darting to the walls, the furniture, the piano. "I don't know, but we shouldn't be here to find out." But Linda wasn't listening. She traced her finger over the note's faded script, lingering on the phrase, "Time is everything." The gold pocket watch gleamed faintly in the dim light, as if urging her to wind it. "Linda, let's go," Richard said, his voice rising. "No," she said, her resolve hardening. "There's something about this watch, this note. He wanted us to find it for a reason." "Linda." The sound of the piano cut him off. The keys played themselves again, but this time, the melody was unfamiliar, fragmented. It was almost as if the house were composing something new, a message hidden in the notes. Richard backed away from the piano, dragging Linda with him. "This isn't safe." The melody suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with anticipation. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, approaching. Linda turned toward the hallway, her heart in her throat. "Do you hear that?" Richard nodded, his face pale. "We're leaving. Now." But before they could move, the pocket watch in Linda's hand began to tick loudly, its hands spinning wildly. A faint glow emanated from its surface, bathing the room in a strange golden light. And then they heard it. A voice, low and melodic, singing words they couldn't quite make out. It was coming from upstairs. Linda glanced at Richard. "We have to see what's up there." Richard stared at her, incredulous. "You've lost your mind." But Linda was already moving, the watch guiding her like a compass. She climbed the staircase slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. Richard followed reluctantly, muttering under his breath. When they reached the top, the hallway stretched out before them, dimly lit and impossibly long, as though it had grown beyond the house's physical boundaries. The voice grew louder, its melody hauntingly beautiful, pulling them toward a closed door at the end of the corridor. Linda hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "What if this is what he meant?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if it's something we don't want to find?" Richard countered. But it was too late. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a room bathed in soft moonlight. In the center of the room stood an antique record player, spinning a vinyl that hadn't been there moments ago. The voice stopped. The record spun in silence for a moment before a faint crackle signaled the start of a recording. Sinatra's voice came through, clear and commanding. If you've made it this far, you're closer than most. But the truth is still buried. Look beyond the music. Look beyond me. The record player fell silent. What does that mean? Richard asked, his voice shaking. Linda's eyes swept the room, searching for clues. That's when she noticed a series of faded footprints on the floor, leading to a small door in the corner of the room. Over there, she said, pointing. Richard hesitated. Do we really want to know what's behind that? Linda didn't answer. She gripped the pocket watch tightly, feeling its ticking resonate in her palm, and took a step toward the door. As she reached for the handle, the air grew colder, and the faint sound of applause echoed around them, as if a ghostly audience were watching their every move. Linda, wait, Richard pleaded. But she couldn't stop now. She opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The smell of cigar smoke wafted up, rich and unmistakable. Without a word, Linda descended, Richard reluctantly following behind. The staircase seemed endless, each step taking them deeper into the heart of something they couldn't comprehend. Finally, they emerged into a hidden room, its walls lined with photographs, notes, and artifacts from Sinatra's life. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a single, untouched envelope. Linda picked it up, her hands trembling, and opened it. Inside was a second note, written in the same bold handwriting. You've come this far, but can you handle the rest? The lights flickered, and the room began to hum with an unseen energy. From somewhere behind them came the sound of footsteps again, this time faster, more insistent. Linda, Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. We're not alone. Linda turned, her breath caught in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if someone or something was descending the staircase they had just come down. Richard grabbed her arm, his face pale and slick with sweat. We need to leave. Now. But Linda's gaze was fixed on the room around them. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift, Sinatra's face almost alive in each frame, his eyes following their every move. The hum in the air grew into a low vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones. And then the record player, inexplicably in the center of the hidden room, crackled to life. Luck be a lady tonight. The voice was rich and full, but it wasn't coming from the record player alone, it was everywhere. Surrounding them, it was as if Sinatra himself stood in the room, singing his timeless tune. Linda, Richard shouted, yanking her arm harder. We're leaving. But Linda shook her head, her eyes locked on the envelope in her hand. The second note had more weight now, more meaning, but can you handle the rest? She placed the note back on the table and stepped toward the farthest corner of the room. There, beneath a dim spotlight that seemed to shine from nowhere, sat a glass display case. Inside was an ornate key, its handle shaped like a treble clef. Below the key, engraved on a brass plaque, were the words, "The final curtain." It's a message, Linda whispered. It's a trap, Richard countered, his voice rising in panic. The footsteps stopped. Both of them froze as a shadow spread across the far wall, elongating and sharpening into the unmistakable silhouette of a man holding a glass. The figure raised it slowly, as though to toast them. Thank you, a deep voice said, rich with charm and authority. Linda and Richard turned, but no one was there. Did you hear that? Linda whispered. Of course I heard it, Richard hissed. The voice came again, echoing through the room. You've seen what you came to see, but not everything. Are you ready to play the final number? The humming grew louder, the walls seeming to tremble with its intensity. Linda reached for the glass case, but as her fingers grazed the surface, the room erupted into chaos. The photographs on the walls fell one by one, revealing blackened voids behind them. The record player screeched, its sound distorted and malevolent. The lights flickered wildly, casting the room into erratic shadows. Richard grabbed Linda and pulled her toward the staircase. "We're leaving. Now!" But the staircase was gone. In its place was a blank wall. Linda spun around, clutching the pocket watch. It was still ticking, its hands now frozen at midnight. "This isn't real," she whispered, trying to convince herself. "Isn't it?" The voice responded, this time closer. From the shadows, the figure emerged. A man in a sharp suit, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. His face was unmistakable, and yet it carried an otherworldly quality, as though it were only half human. "Frank," Linda whispered. The figure smiled, tilting his head slightly. "I gave you a choice. You could have walked away. But now," he gestured toward the glass case. The key inside glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Take it," Sinatra said. "What happens if I do?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. The smile widened. "You'll know the truth. But every truth has a price." Richard stepped between them, his hands raised. "No, we're done. We're not playing this game anymore." Sinatra's gaze shifted to Richard, his expression darkening. "It was never your game to begin with." Before either of them could react, the room dissolved into darkness. The walls, the furniture, even the air itself seemed to collapse inward, leaving only Linda, Richard, and Sinatra standing in an infinite void. The key floated out of the case, hovering in the space between them. "This is your last chance," Sinatra said, his voice echoing. "Take it or leave it." Linda hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The key was so close, so tantalizing. She reached out, her fingers trembling. "Linda, don't," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking. But something deep within her knew she had to. She grabbed the key. The void exploded with light, blinding and brilliant. Linda felt herself falling, spinning, as Sinatra's voice echoed around her, growing fainter with every second. "Time is everything, but only for those who dare." When she opened her eyes, she was standing outside Twin Palms, the sun rising on the horizon. The house was silent, the air still. Richard was beside her, staring at her in shock. "What happened? How did we?" Linda looked down at her hand. The pocket watch was gone, but the key remained, warm against her palm. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back toward the house, her mind racing. Somewhere within those walls lay the final piece of the puzzle. And she knew, without a doubt, that Sinatra wasn't finished with her yet. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.